Hello everyone and welcome back to Political Behavior. This week we are looking at what I have titled pressure groups. Now you may be unfamiliar with the term pressure groups. This is more common in the academic literature. You may know these organizations as interest groups. We prefer the term pressure groups because these are organizations and entities that exert pressure onto the political system and affect political outcomes. Interest groups, on the other hand, a variety of groups have interest. They may or may not exert influence onto the political system. So the term pressure group better characterizes the relationship these organizations and entities have on the political system. So we've talked previously about definitions of politics. We've talked about the view that politics is an iterative game, that parties and politicians need to consider future elections and not simply try and win 100% of the time. This is true for politicians, this is true for political parties, this is not so true for pressure groups. Pressure groups are characterized by consistently advocating for a set of policy priorities that they wish to see enacted or otherwise put into law. The idea of this iterative game is mainly for the big game or party politics, which is a little bit separate from this conceptualization of pressure politics. Now, your textbook discusses a couple of different theories about how to conceptualize this influence. We've talked previously about the idea of pluralism. It's been discussed in your textbook. This is the idea that politics generally and political outcomes in particular are best defined as innumerable interests competing for influence over the levers of decision making. This view is also discussed in the required reading for this week, the nouns chapter. Now, this view in this chapter is contrasted with the subgovernmental theory. This is one view, a bit outdated at this point, alongside the policy domains view, or the idea that political outcomes are perhaps best understood not just by looking at elected officials and interest groups, but instead looking at the myriad individuals and organizations that deal with a particular policy or deal with a particular policy domain. For example, something like oil companies and environmental groups, those aren't only the ones contesting over this particular issue. There's also, of course, politicians, but bureaucrats from the Department of Energy or the Environmental Protection Agency. In the domain of the conflict between oil extraction, exploration, and refining, as well as environmental protections, they're the ones who are going to be involved in the day-to-day processes of crafting those bureaucratic restrictions and regulations, as well as enforcing them. So it's a bit broader of a view than something like pluralism here. Now, in this view, this conflict between interests or pressures results in outcomes that we can consider policy. This is, of course, actual legislation, but also those bureaucratic regulation. And pressure groups themselves have a great degree of interest over these specific regulations. For something like an economically oriented pressure group, this can have a significant impact on their bottom line. Now, it's very much rarely the case that in these kind of conflicts within this view of policy domains or even in pluralism, that one side is going to get 100% of what they want and the other side is going to get 0% of what they want. More often, it's going to be some mix between the two. Looking at how we determine what that eventual result actually is, we need to look at the relative strength of all of the innumerable factors within that policy domain. To simplify here, within that disagreement between oil producers and environmentalists, if it was the case that it was a purely economic consideration, well, in that case, the oil producer are very likely to have an advantage in that. On the other hand, if money was no object and it was purely public opinion, the environmentalists might actually have a bit of an advantage there. But it's never the case that these can be disentangled from one another. And neither the oil producers nor the environmentalists can win the contest by themselves. They join together with other similar pressure groups. The politicians themselves much balance the variety of interests. Something like environmentalism or the needs of of oil producers are very much niche interests within politics. They represent a very small slice of the political sphere. And as a result, politicians are dealing with the broad conception of the public, and therefore must balance the needs and priorities of these pressure groups accordingly. As Schattschneider argues, pressure groups are small organizations that do not have the political resources to play in the great arena for the highest stakes. In each of these views, political outcomes are not just the result of voting and elected officials. Rather, as discussed in Schattschneider, one of the choice readings for this week's, politics is conflict. Conflict over these resources, over influence, and over identity. And so when considering this conflict and considering the role of pressure groups, we have to consider the scope of this conflict, who's involved in it, as well as who is exerting pressure, how effectively, and through what way. And so when we think about pressure groups here, the kind of broad question is fundamentally how much influence do these interest groups, do these pressure groups, do lobbyists actually have on the political process here? And the readings may challenge some of your preconceived notion about how influential these interests actually are. Moneyed interests, the common conception is that politicians in America are bought and paid for, that there is entirely too much money in politics, and the resultant political outcomes that we see are the result of these moneyed interests. That's a bit too simplistic. Let's kind of walk through the potential causal mechanisms for this. If it was the idea that politicians change their votes upon receiving donations from a particular interest, this is kind of way too visible. It's very unlikely, in fact, that a politician, once elected, is going to receive a big donation from some pressure group and change their voting behavior as a result. For one, the Federal Election Commission, the executive agency or federal agency that is responsible for overseeing the adherence to campaign finance laws, they're going to raise some red flags. An individual will be in violation of those campaign finance laws if it's a quid pro quo in that way. It's highly visible and highly dangerous for both the pressure group as well as the politician in that kind of relationship. Moreover, though, if a politician changes their voting behavior as a result of receiving an influx of financial resources or other supports, the voters are very likely to not vote for that politician come the next election. Presumably they are voting for that politician to enact a certain set of political and policy priorities. If that politician fails to uphold those, they're very likely to be voted out on the next election. So that kind of view of quid pro quo, money in exchange for votes or money in exchange for legislation, it's very much unlikely that that's the dominant force and pressure that these groups actually exert. Another potential mechanism could be that those moneyed interests, those pressure groups, exert their primary influence at either the primary or at the general election stage. Once the candidates are announced or during the candidate selection process, those interests will give money to those candidates that best represent their interest. And as a result of having those greater resources, the individual politician will be more likely to be elected. This is very much possible, but there's a limit to the extent of this influence. It is not the case that, for example, the NRA, the National Rifle Association, could give hundreds of millions of dollars to an individual candidate and have them win in a district no matter what. If that district is predominantly or majoritarian, or a majority of that district is against guns or is in favor of greater gun control, regardless of how much money the NRA gives to an individual candidate, they are not going to win that election. And every pressure group is dealing with scarce resources. They need to be intelligent about where they spend those resources. And as a result, they're very likely to put money into very likely to win, or at least somewhat likely to win, races. The question is therefore, at which stage is the money influencing this system? It's very unlikely and uncommon that it's actually this quid pro quo system. Instead, it tends to occur more so at the primary or at the general election stage. It's still a big issue, and this is especially after Citizens United, which are textbook we'll talk about later in the semester. But this is less, shall we say, nefarious than the public very often makes it out to be, or this relationship is in the public consciousness, if we want to put it that way. So who and when does pressure actually succeed at influencing policy? Nones describes conditions and strategies where pressure groups are more and less likely to achieve their specific aims when interfacing with government. I want to talk about 3 of these really quickly, just because I think they warrant a bit more of a discussion. The first condition here is maintaining the status quo. The status quo itself, what is currently in law, carries inertia. Change, especially at the federal level, but also at the state level, is actually relatively rare. Once something is instantiated into the federal code or into law, it takes a great deal of effort to actually change that. And so if a policy group, if a pressure group is exerting influence in order to keep something the way that it is, that's going to be much less costly than a pressure group trying to change a law or trying to get a new law or regulation onto the books. Schatzsnyder discusses the first mover advantage, and this is a manifestation of this first mover advantage. If, as a pressure group, you can get your preferred position into law before any other actors influence the process, you can defend that position via this inertia of the status quo. Another condition that I want to briefly discuss here is what Nones terms matters that are nonpartisan and non-ideological. I don't know if you've paid attention to political media in the last, 2 decades or so. There are very few things today that are non-ideological and nonpartisan. There may be things that both parties agree upon. And actually, Nones' example here, the ideas of disability support as well as veterans affairs, these are both supported by the Republicans and the Democrats. In terms of other matters that are nonpartisan and non-ideological, we can pretty much ignore these in the contemporary era. The trends of the nationalization of politics alongside polarization and other trends have made pretty much everything political. And if a new dimension of consideration is introduced into the political sphere, it very rapidly takes on partisan hues in a way that in previous decades it may not have. So in terms of this condition, perhaps a little bit overstated in this particular chapter. The only strategy that I want to talk about here is Nones' strategy 5, contributing money. Nones discuss how money buys access, not necessarily votes here. Access is enormously important for lobbyists on behest of pressure groups. This access can get the ear of a particular legislator and provide a conduit for information. As I'll discuss in a moment, information is enormously valuable here. However, Nones was published in 2013. The Citizens United case that occurred in 2010, the full ramifications of that with super PACs and 501c3s had not fully manifested when this chapter was written. So I would argue that strategy 5 is perhaps a bit more influential than Nones notes here. Specifically within this context, the use of funds by pressure groups to change public opinion, to affect attitudes, to affect hearts and minds, something we'll talk about later in the semester, ad buys and paid media instead of earned media. All of these exert an enormous impact on the political system and the resulting political outcomes, because as I mentioned previously, what matters here is public preferences. If the public is voting a certain way on the basis of their attitudes, on the basis of their opinions, that matters a great deal more than a couple $1 million going to an individual legislator who may or may not feel a a need to vote one way or another. The influence of money in the contemporary political environment, and again, something we'll talk about in subsequent weeks, is enormously important and does exert a significant impact on the political process here. This is also a two-way street, though. Money counterbalances money, and certainly a situation like oil producers versus environmentalists, there's going to be an economic disparity there. But in many policy domains within American politics, there actually is a relatively balanced, both economically and in terms of voting behavior, equilibrium between competing interests. American politics has been going on for quite some time. On occasion, we get upheavals, we get a reorientation around which the dimensions are being contested, but very often these are settled 50-50 style cleavages or otherwise dimensions or disagreements within American politics. So money does cut both ways. Final question here is, so what is the influence or the impact of these pressure groups on government? The other choice reading other than Schattschneider that you have this week is Milbrath, where basically he goes through and he interviews lobbyists several decades ago, as well as legislators in Washington, to try and get their perspectives on the efficacy of lobbying and the efficacy of pressure groups on the legislative process. Milbrath emphasizes the idea that information, not necessarily money, but information is actually the most important currency that lobbyists can give to individual politicians. While campaign donations and contributions are certainly useful, certainly desired, they will certainly elicit a thank you, a specific poll about a constituent, an elected representative's constituents' desire on a certain topic, or specialized language that will accomplish a specific regulatory goal, is highly useful and is difficult for individual legislators with limited staffs to actually achieve. This is information that will specifically help the politician at the ballot box is enormously important. And so when we combine that with the access purchased from money and the ability to provide information that will be useful to the politician, that is a significant conduit of influence from these pressure groups onto individual legislators or politicians in general. And specifically, this specified or specific legislative language or regulatory language. One of the things that is discussed here is that if there's not a lot of attention public-wise, if there's not a lot of attention on a specific policy domain, it's much more likely for these pressure groups to actually accomplish their aims. This can be the case if it's enormously complicated and the public doesn't really understand what is being discussed, or if it's something that no one cares about. Banking regulations, for example, can be enormously complicated. Most people have a broad view about banks or moneyed interests in general, but the specific disclosure requirements for banks or the amount of money that they have to keep on hand, that's not really going to be salient. That's not really going to be in the public's mind. That's not really going to be something that they are voting on come election time. But to those banks, to those other economic interests, that can be enormously profitable and therefore a great demand of legislators when they're crafting that legislative or regulatory language that governs the behaviors of those entities here. Fundamentally, to kind of close up here, politicians that follow the pure desires of either one or a set of pressure groups are very unlikely to win election or re-election. Politicians balance the needs and desires of their constituents alongside the pressure groups. And if the needs and desires of their constituents come into conflict with those pressure groups, it's very likely that the needs and desires of the constituents will win out. Pressure groups can exert an influence. And specifically, once a piece of legislation is actually put into law, once a regulation is put into the federal code, it's much more difficult to actually get that reversed. And effective pressure groups really pressure the public more so than the politician. We have an election coming up here in several months in November. You'll see campaign ads. You will see the attempt to shape the hearts and mind, to shape public opinion, and as a result of that, affect voting behavior of the public to get different politicians and legislators actually elected. But legislators themselves, they focus much more so on those individual campaign promises that they made to the public and trying to get those enacted. And they're less so beholden to those pressure groups if they want to either win election or be re-elected. The areas where pressure groups are most effective are where the public doesn't care about an issue or if it's too complicated. This is the greatest opportunity that pressure groups have to exert an influence. So that is all that I have for you this week. Be sure to keep an eye on the due dates for this week on screen now. And as always, feel free to reach out via email if you have any questions or concerns. Enjoy the rest of your week, and I will see all of you next week.